Hello, wherever you are, and thanks for inviting me into your home once more. It's been a bit of a wait, so I really appreciate your patience, but I rather hope it's been worth it, as we look and look again at Masters of Terror, the BBC2 double bill season from 1979.
And a very good evening from me, your brand spanking new continuity announcer. I do hope you enjoy the dulcet tones. As Crab, I have a face for radio. So then, Crab, what particular cats have you got in the bag for us in tonight's programme of peril?
Hammer heavy, so it can't be all bad.
Would you permit me to give the fiefdom a sneaky peek?
Après vous?
My God. The goat of Mentis. The devil himself.
Oh yes, spot on, Crab. This could be rather good.
I do hope so, continuity. I really do.
Then let's not delay things any further. Time to roll those psychedelic wing-ding credits. Good evening. You are watching BBC2. Tonight we begin a season of late-night double bills, Masters of Terror, with the emphasis on the bizarre and the supernatural. At approximately 10:30, and for the first time on British television, we present Dr. X. After a series of ghoulish murders near the laboratory of Dr. Xavier, suspicion falls upon the doctor and his colleagues. Determined to uncover the killer by his own unusual methods, he conducts a dangerous experiment under the light of the full moon. Lionel Atwill and Fay Wray, familiar faces from the Hollywood horror films of the 1930s, star in this eerie tale of a mysterious cannibal. Following the late news and weather, shortly after midnight, we continue with a color production from Hammer Film Studios, The Curse of Frankenstein. Peter Cushing appears as Baron Frankenstein, with Christopher Lee as the creature in this celebrated adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, and if you're of a nervous disposition, you may wish to keep the lights on. Our summer evening of horror begins now with Dr. X.
Lee Taylor, a wise-cracking reporter for the Daily World, begins investigating a string of grisly murders that occur whenever the full moon rises. The victims show unmistakable signs of cannibalism.
Gentlemen, that wasn't torn. This is cannibalism.
and witnesses claim the killer is a horribly disfigured figure, almost a monster. The trial leads to the Academy of Surgical Research, run by the formidable Dr. Escavier. The police suspect someone inside the institute, since the scalpel used in the killings is a type issued only to Escavier's staff. A small group of eccentric scientists quickly fall under suspicion. Dr. Wells, who studies cannibalism, Dr. Haynes, the crippled Dr. Duke, and the enigmatic Dr. Rowitz. Determined to clear his institution's name, Dr. Escavier gathers everyone at his Long Island estate and prepares a daring experiment. A bizarre scientific test designed to expose the full moon killer.
Tube. It's a success. The guilty man is...
When Universal Studios began making serious money from their gothic horror cycle in the early 1930s, Warner's clearly decided they wanted a share of the pie and pounced on the opportunity. If horror was suddenly fashionable, Warner Brothers would simply do it bigger. Their answer, dear viewer, was Dr. X from 1932, and crucially, they would give audiences something Universal could not yet offer: a horror film in colour, of sorts. The film was photographed in the early two-strip Technicolor process, a strange and limited system that could only reproduce reds and greens. To my eyes, it looks almost hallucinatory. Flesh tones drift into sickly pinks, while the shadows pulse with a strange viridian light, and the entire image carries an unnatural, faintly bilious quality. The process may lack the realism later achieved with three-stripped Technicolor, and colour cinema would not fully take hold until a few years later, but in the case of Dr. X, and Warner's stablemate to this, Mystery of the Wax Museum the following year, that strange palette for me turns out to be a gift rather than a handicap. Dr. X hardly looks natural at all. In places to me it looked distinctly off-kilter, and for a horror picture, that is precisely the point. Interestingly, Warner Brothers hedged their bets. While the Technicolor version played in major cities, a separate black and white version was shot simultaneously with different takes used for some scenes. Smaller towns and foreign markets often received the monochrome version instead, a decision that reportedly irked Technicolor enormously. For decades, the colour version was thought lost until it was rediscovered and restored in about 1973 by UCLA, allowing modern audiences to finally see the film as originally intended. Now, structurally, Dr. X is a rather peculiar concoction. For much of its running time, it behaves less like a straight horror film and more like a Warner Brothers crime drama with a splash of kook. The studio at the time had perfected the hyped-up newspaper reporter picture, and that energy is present here in the form of wisecracking journalist Lee Taylor.
Hi, babe.
Hey, where you going?
Inside.
No, you ain't. Only stiffs go in there tonight.
No kid.
No kidding.
What's keeping you out?
What?
Played by actor Lee Tracy, whose rapid-fire sarcasm injects a surprisingly broad comic streak into the film. I didn't mind him, to be honest with you. Some of his antics I found mildly amusing, although for some he rubbed people up the wrong way, but not me.
Hi,
Good gracious.
What do you got there? Nothing, just a little handshake buzzer. You see, fits right in the palm of your hand. You wind it up like that, and it discourages these professional handshakers.
I ought to have one on each hand from my beat here. Well, I gotta be going now. Goodbye. So long. Forgot all about that thing.
This also proves that not all leading men, or the eventual love interest of the female protagonist, has to have Hollywood looks. Dr. X is an odd mixture of macabre, mirth and mystery, but it reflects the film's theatrical origins. The screenplay by Robert Tasker and Earl Baldwin was adapted from a 1931 stage play, Dr. X, originally called The Terror, by Howard W. Comstock and Alan C. Miller. And that structure of suspects gathered in a brooding, sinister location gives the film something of the classic old dark house flavour. Lurking beneath the witty banter is material that could only exist in the pre-code era of Hollywood filmmaking. This was before the motion picture production code was of course rigorously enforced, and Dr. X takes advantage of that liberty. The story carefully references themes that would soon become strictly forbidden areas in this cinematic art form. For here we have prostitution, murder, and most strikingly, cannibalism. One of the suspects is literally conducting research into the subject, highly repellent from the pearl clutches at the censor's board. Visually, a heart bobbing in a jar, blood-spattered medical gowns, and a brief touch of smut also adds that touch of cinema verite. It's precisely this kind of salacious detail that gives Dr. X its exploitational edge. The central figure, tying the grim scenario together, is Dr. Excavier, played by the great Lionel Atwill. We've seen him in loads of things in our journey, dear viewer, haven't we? And as witnessed, Atwill would go on to become one of the most recognisable faces of 1930s and 40s horror cinema, and a cause célèbre behind it. Cool as a cucumber, authoritative and calm to an almost uncanny degree. Despite the film carrying his character's name in the title, Dr. Excavier is not the mad scientist I anticipated. In fact, he represents the rational mind trying to expose the moon killer in their midst. His method of doing so, however, is wonderfully banal in itself. Atwill presides over a bizarre pseudo-scientific experiment designed to recreate the circumstances of the slaughter. The suspects are strapped into chairs while an elaborate device measures their psychological reactions, complete with towering tubes filled with a blood-coloured fluid that rises and falls with their pulse. What we get is perhaps the most extravagantly gothic lie detector test ever imagined, all set within a retro-futuristic Art Deco laboratory of pulsing, throbbing glass tubes and rising phials of crimson liquid, climbing higher and higher as the suspect's blood pressure gives the game away. It's enormous fun and visually quite an accomplishment. And it's exactly the sort of delirious pulp science that makes early horror cinema so jolly, and I loved it. Another key presence here, of course, is Fay Wray, still a year away from immortality in King Kong, but already staking her claim as one of cinema's original great scream queens. Wray plays Joanne Excavier, the devoted daughter of Atwill's scientist, and though the script largely confines her to reacting to the chaos around her, typical of the era, she nevertheless provides a welcome touch of humanity amid the film's darker goings-on. The true visual architect of the film, however, is director Michael Curtiz, and I must say, dear viewer, revisiting his work here and his other offerings that we've looked at in the previous seasons has been a genuine pleasure for me. Again, we have here an opportunity to admire the hand of a true cinematic maestro. Working with Technicolor cinematographer Ray Renanen and the distinguished production designer Anton Grott, Curtiz fashions a world of dense shades, strange scientific contrivances, and close, oppressive, claustrophobic interiors. Despite the limitations of the colour process, Curtiz uses light and composition in almost expressionistic ways, isolating faces in darkness, flooding scenes with unnatural hues, and guiding the viewer's eye across the frame with remarkable precision. Then comes the final act, and this is where Dr. X becomes something else entirely. The film's climax, involving the revelation of the killer and his grotesque method of disguise, drifts into territory that feels startlingly modern. The villain transforms himself using a bilious gloop substance he repeatedly refers to as synthetic flesh. Watching the character smear the goo across his face, constructing a new identity from a rubbery biological mask, such imagery becomes strangely prophetic. You can almost hear David Cronenberg salivating. The idea of body modification, of science reshaping human flesh into something monstrous, feels uncannily ahead of its time. In that peculiar red-green Technicolor glow, the sequence becomes something quite extraordinary, and with that hypnotic, galvanic energy soundtrack, it's mesmerising surrealism. The monster makeup was created by none other than Max Factor, a name far better known for beautifying Hollywood stars and turning them into grotesque cannibal killers, yet the result is remarkably effective. Thick brows, flattened features, exaggerated lips, and enormous claw-like hands. Dr. X also introduced audiences to a particularly memorable villain in Dr. Wells, played by actor Preston Foster, a disturbed scientist whose obsession with the moon drives him into increasingly grotesque behaviour. Foster's snarling performance is definitely worth a mention out of an otherwise sterling cast. Dr. X stands at the crossroads of several traditions: the theatrical old dark house mystery, the mad scientist genre, and the early experimentation with colour film technology. For me, Dr. X sits comfortably alongside Mystery of the Wax Museum as one of the great Warner Brothers horror oddities of the early 1930s. An outre view, dear viewer, but a hugely entertaining one. One Esther Anderson from Chicago, Illinois, felt it was too when she wrote into the New Movie magazine in 1932 and said of it,
"I just saw Dr. X and that's the reason for the shakes. It goes all the boo films ever made, one better. Even better than Dracula, White Zombie, and others I've seen. If Hollywood doesn't stop scaring us all to death, the future film audience will be strapped in straitjackets soon. But who doesn't appreciate a spooky thrill? No matter how it scares you, you like it. Give us more bogeyman pictures, producers, and we'll spend all our money to go and get a good scare. The more I see, the more I want."
I thoroughly enjoyed seeing this again, dear viewer. What a treat after so many years. So you know what? I'm giving Dr. X 4 creeping fleshies out of 5. With Curtiz directing and Anton Grott designing those sinister sets, frankly, what else would you expect?
Synthetic flesh.
A priest rides into a remote mountain prison to hear the confession of Baron Victor Frankenstein, a man condemned to hang. Calm and lucid, he insists he is neither mad nor mistaken, and begins to recount how it began. Years earlier, as an obsessive young nobleman, he brings a tutor, Paul Kremp, into his household, and together they uncover the secret of restoring life, but ambition turns to obsession. Bodies are obtained, graves violated, and when a suitable brain cannot be secured, Frankenstein commits murder to procure one.
You step back a little. You'll sit better. Look out, Professor! Look out!
To prove a man may manufacture life as easily as he dismembers it. Within a tower of dynamos and scorching current, the assembled figure lives. As the brain is damaged, the creature awakens, confused, violent, and afraid. It breaks free of its bonds, and the thing Frankenstein created begins its education in murder. By 1957, Hammer had been busy, but The Curse of Frankenstein was the moment everything changed, not just for the studio, but for British horror itself. Gothic returned to the cinema in full-bloodied colour. Hammer understood something audiences immediately recognised. Horror should feel dangerous. The film offered what they felt was a winner and became a trademark. Cleavage in corpuscles, romance, shock, and a faint whiff of sadism, all wrapped up in melodrama. It also united Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. What they grasped instinctively was that Hammer only works if the actors take it seriously. No winking, no parody. They play it as straight drama, dear viewer. Cushing's Baron is not a dreamer, but a cold, ambitious aristocrat, while Lee gives the creature in this movie a tragic, almost childlike physicality. Shot from November 1956 on a modest £65,000 budget, the production nearly looked very different. Early drafts from Max Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky, remember them? They proposed a black and white film and even considered Boris Karloff. Then Universal threatened legal action if Hammer resembled their own Frankenstein cycle. Jimmy Sangster rewrote the script entirely, relocating the emphasis onto Victor himself, and Terence Fisher chose Eastman colour. Suddenly, blood was not suggested, it was seen. Even casting worried the American backers who feared unknown British actors. They needn't have. Cushing created a charming monster in human form, urbane, witty, and utterly without conscience. Critics in 1957 were absolutely appalled. Words like repulsive and degrading appeared in respectable newspapers.
Character and story have faded into the background. Suspense and surprise simply do not exist. Plot has become a perfunctory, filling in of time between each macabre set piece. The logical development of this kind of thing is a peep show of freaks interspersed with visits to a torture chamber. It is a depressing and degrading thought for anyone who loves the cinema.
Sounds good to me, dear viewer. Audiences, however, were less prissy and queued around the block. American receipts alone returned many times the film's cost and secured Hammer's future almost overnight. I actually covered the film in greater depth in a previous Look, Look and Look Again episode as part of my Hammer Odyssey, so do seek that out if you want the full surgical slice of themes and undertones. But however you approach it, dear viewer, the verdict here is simple. The Curse of Frankenstein is not merely a success, it is a cornerstone of British cinema, an absolute classic. For that reason, The Curse of Frankenstein earns the only fitting award, 5 transplanted hearts out of 5.
I thought I'd find you here.
It was very intelligent of you. Now that you found me, what do you want?
You killed the old man, didn't you? You killed him and now you're mutilating his body.
Mutilating? I've removed his brain. Mutilating has nothing to do with it.
I can't prove you murdered him, but I can stop you using his brain.
Why? He has no further use for it?
Don't be a fool! Be careful!
You damn it! Get out! Get away from here! Leave me alone! Get out of here!
Masters of Terror, our season of midnight movie double bills, begins in 5 minutes, when Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce star as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in the 1944 production Sherlock Holmes and the Spiderwoman. First, the news on 2 with Peter Woods.
And now on to Sherlock Holmes and the Spiderwoman. Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce star as Holmes and Dr. Watson, setting out to solve the mystery of a sinister woman whose victims are driven to a most unnatural end. It is not perhaps entirely elementary, but the great detective soon has the measure of it. At midnight, following the Benson and Hedges Cup final, with Peter West we return to Baker Street for another adventure, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Peter Cushing appears as the great detective, with Andre Morel as Watson and Christopher Lee as Sir Henry Baskerville, in Hammer's colour adaptation of Conan Doyle's most famous story. But first we are caught in the web of the Spiderwoman.
A strange wave of deaths grips the city when several wealthy, respectable men are found dead in their own homes after apparently taking their own lives. Cases the paparazzi sensationally dub the pajama suicides. Unconvinced by the verdict of suicide, Sherlock Holmes suspects something far more sinister at work. Disguised as a wealthy retired Indian officer, Holmes sets a trap of his own, hoping to lure the culprit into the open. The bait works, drawing the attention of the elegant but dangerous Adria Spedding. But Spedding is no ordinary thug. She quickly sees through Holmes' disguise and proves herself every bit of the adversary he anticipated. What follows is a duel of wits, deception, and lethal traps, resulting in a perilous showdown at a fun fair where Holmes finds himself spinning helplessly on a carousel, with Watson forced to take a shot that could either save his friend or snuff him out.
I say, Holmes, where have you been all this time?
I've been going round and round in a circle.
Circle?
Yes, but my heart wasn't in it.
The Spiderwoman is often considered one of the finest outings for this incarnation of Sherlock Holmes and Watson, played stupendously by Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. It's the 7th of 14 films based on Arthur Conan Doyle's literary detective. For me, these films carry a tremendous spark of nostalgia. I remember them vividly as staples of BBC2 tea time entertainment when I was young. Through the 1980s, they cropped up regularly alongside those glorious Tarzan movies, and seeing them again now still brings that warm, nostalgic grin. Rathbone and Bruce had already made quite an impression together. They first teamed up in The Hound of Baskervilles, which we reviewed in a prior episode of our Look, Look and Look Again horror double bills, followed by The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Both of these movies were produced by 20th Century Fox. After those films, the pair moved briefly to radio, recording 3 highly commended Sherlock Holmes plays. But before long, this brilliant partnership returned to the silver screen, this time under contract with the Universal Pictures, who produced a small but memorable run of Holmes films. Universal acquired the rights to Holmes and Watson from the Conan Doyle estate for a 7-year period, along with exclusive rights to Conan Doyle's 21 original Holmes stories, all for the princely sum of $300,000. However, Universal made a notable change. For wartime propaganda purposes, the stories were shifted from Victorian London to the contemporary setting of wartime America during the Second World War. The first batch of these films, Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, combines Doyle's His Last Bow with Lord Haw-Haw. Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon combines Doyle's The Adventures of the Dancing Men with Lionel Atwill, no less, as Moriarty, trading secrets of a new bomb invention to those nasty Nazis. And Sherlock Holmes in Washington, which is not based on any Conan Doyle story at all.
Democracy. The only hope for the future, eh, Holmes?
It's not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. But in the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
That's magnificent. I quite agree with you.
Not with me, with Mr. Winston Churchill. I was quoting from the speech he made not so long ago, in that very building.
all of them throwing our heroes into pulpy, audacious wartime espionage thrillers. Though loosely inspired by Conan Doyle's work, Universal often steered so far from the original source material that the films became adventures in their own right. Sherlock Holmes and Washington particularly stands out in that regard. Universal insisted the stories were timeless and would work perfectly well in a modern setting. Rathbone and Bruce, however, were reportedly far less enthusiastic about the idea. The tone shifted again in 1943 with Sherlock Holmes Faces Death, loosely based on Doyle's The Musgrave Ritual. It was the third Holmes film directed by Roy William Neill, who would go on to direct the remainder of the series until it eventually petered out. Neill had a flair for gothic atmosphere, something he demonstrated earlier in Columbia Pictures' The Black Room and the gourmand British production of Dr. Sin. With Faces Death, we see a welcome return to that darker, more gothic milieu. And it's after Sherlock Holmes Faces Death that we arrive at the corker that is the Spiderwoman, whereas it was billed for the BBC2 double bill, Sherlock Holmes and the Spiderwoman, or finally, as I like to say, the Spiderwoman. Childish, I know, but there we are. Here, Roy William Neill presents Holmes with one of his most radiant and deadly adversaries, played with sheer aplomb by Gail Sondergaard. The film cleverly combines elements from several Conan Doyle stories, including The Final Problem, The Sign of Four, The Empty House, and The Devil's Foot. Sondergaard plays Adria Spedding, a calculating killer, who dispatches her wealthy victims using a deadly Lycosa carnivora spider in order to claim their insurance money and maintain the lifestyle to which she's been accustomed. The insurance scam angle recalls the Lugosi thriller, for me, The Dark Eyes of London, while the use of a spider to nearly dispatch Holmes feels like a curious precursor to Bond's brush with death and Dr. No, and of course echoes Doyle's own tale, The Speckled Band. From The Sign of Four, we get inspiration for a maniacal midget character, with cinematic nods to films like The Unholy Three and Freaks. Here that role is played by Angelo Rossitto, who appears as Obongo from the Congo, the prancing pygmy. Sounds like a bit like Britain's Got Talent, doesn't it? It's touches like this that make the Spider-Woman wonderfully eccentric and unique to the usual tropes. Another memorable presence is 7-year-old Teddy in Fur as Larry, the Spider-Woman's mute nephew. The role almost feels like a mini-me Renfield. This unsettling child is not only fond of eating flies, but also has a quirky odd little hop in his step, and even plays a part in producing a poisonous gas that nearly does away with Holmes and Watson using nothing more than a burning candy wrapper. Bloody ingenious, what a little psycho. All of these strange little flourishes add a delightfully ghoulish edge to the story, but the real masterstroke here is presenting Holmes with what is essentially a female Moriarty. Much of the success comes down to the actress playing Adria herself, as Sondergaard later recalled.
The characterization was up to me. She was not intricately received. Frankly, it was something to help pay the bills. I knew it wasn't art. I certainly didn't think it would outlast all my pictures.
Here she embodies the quintessential femme fatale, and the crackle between her and Rathbone in their scenes together is top-notch. Sondergaard oozes what the French call BCBG, a sleek, serpentine schemer she is. As the film moves towards its climax, we also see the wartime context creeping back in a little. The finale at the fun fair features shooting targets of none other than Hitler, what looks like Mussolini, and a toothy, stereotypical nip. It's another memorable sequence, particularly when Holmes finds himself spinning around on that revolving carousel while Watson attempts to shoot the villain straight through Holmes's aorta. How diabolical. The Spider-Woman did return in The Spider-Woman Strikes Back in 1946, however, that's got nothing to do with this movie by sharing the titular villainess. To be honest, I watched Spider-Woman twice, once with my mum when we caught it on Sky Arts channel, and then again while preparing this review. Both times it was an hour or so of sheer enjoyment. Despite its B-movie restrictions, this is high-octane daring-do with a flourish of eccentricity that absolutely captivates. The on-screen chemistry between Rathbone and Bruce remains undeniable, arguably the definitive Holmes and Watson pairing. But the Spider-Woman has always had a way of popping up throughout my life. Very strange. From watching it with my nan on BBC2 sometime in the 80s, or to go back then, to seeing it again with my mum, and now discussing it here with you, dear viewer. For a B-movie, it has a cavalcade of recommendations going for it. Script, acting, character, pace, direction, and pure, unadulterated work. It really does have so much to offer and remains immensely enjoyable. And I suspect I'll be happily reunited with it again whenever it decides to pop up. A classic. So for me, The Spider-Woman, receives 4 creeping arachnids out of 5. A gem.
Oh, you naughty boy. Put on your shoes and socks.
No, let him go barefoot. Boys like to. Didn't you, Watson?
You know what?
Like to go barefoot.
Yes, I always ran through the dewy grass in the early mornings. They used to call me Twinkle Toes.
I'm sure you were a beautiful baby, Watson.
When Sir Charles Baskerville was found dead beside the fog-shrouded moors of Dartmoor, Dr. Mortimer turns to Sherlock Holmes. Legend tells of a monstrous hound that has hunted the Baskerville line for generations, and now the heir, Sir Henry, has arrived to claim the estate. Watson escorts him to Baskerville Hall, where the night air carries distant howls. A convict stalks the moor, and a tarantula is used in a very human attempt at murder. The truth behind the curse is no ghost story at all, but on those blackened moors, something very real was hunting, and someone intends poor Sir Henry to be its next victim. I actually examined the hounds of Baskervilles in far greater depth in an earlier Look Again, of course my ongoing Hammer Odyssey, so do seek that out if you want the full bark of themes and deviations from Conan Doyle. The project for this began when Hammer's American backers suggested something unusual, Sherlock Holmes, but in colour, and the beginning of a potential series. Peter Cushing, a lifelong admirer of the Strand magazine stories he collected obsessively, was delighted to be cast, though he was less thrilled to hear his interpretation promoted as a sexy Sherlock. His gaunt appearance on screen wasn't dedication to the role. Cushing was actually recovering from dysentery, contracted while filming in Spain, and producer Anthony Hines, bless him, mistakenly praised his dramatic weight loss as method acting, oblivious to the poor bugger's suffering from the shits.
Tony Hines, the producer, said how professional I was to have lost weight, especially to play that gaunt detective. I'm afraid I hadn't been as conscientious as all that. It was Spain what done it. I'd been out there making John Paul Jones, and a bout of mild dysentery had fined me down.
Location work for the Dartmoor exteriors was filmed not on Dartmoor at all, but around Surrey, with interiors at Bray Studios. The Great Hound, dear viewer, proved another problem. The doglet used was a gentle, affectionate creature and far more inclined to lick actors to death than savage them. Makeup for it repeatedly vanished between takes, forcing the production to rely on a crude prosthetic head with mixed success. For this production, Hammer even attempted forced perspective tricks using miniature sets and children dressed as Holmes and Watson buried under dry ice fog. The results were wisely abandoned. Released in 1959 with a mild A certificate, audiences expecting the studio's usual shocks found a restrained mystery instead, and the proposed Holmes series quietly ended before it began. An interesting experiment, dear viewer, a handsome production, but not top-tier Hammer for me. The Hound of Baskervilles earns 3 yaps out of 5.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
We continue our late-night season of horror double bills, Masters of Terror. In a moment, Night Monster. Bela Lugosi and Lionel Atwill appear in this atmospheric thriller from Universal, set in a remote house where a series of mysterious and unsettling murders take place. Then, following the news and weather at 11:30, the chills continue with The Devil Rides Out. The Duke de Richelieu discovers his friend Simon has fallen under the influence of a black magic coven and sets out to rescue him. From the sinister High Priest, Makata. If the house makes a noise during this one, it may not be the plumbing. But first, from Universal, Night Monster.
Three doctors arrive at the gloomy mansion of the wealthy Kurt Ingston, summoned with the promise of generous funding for their research. There's just one curious detail. These are the very men who once treated Ingston and failed to prevent the terrible operation that left him without an arm and both legs. Also in residence are Ingston's concerned sister, a visiting psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Harper, and the enigmatic mystic, Agor Singh, who claims he can help Ingston come to terms with his crippled body. But the uneasy gathering soon turns deadly. One by one, guests and servants are found strangled in the night, sometimes in their bedrooms, sometimes out in the darkness of the grounds. Is there a murderer hiding among them? Or is something far stranger stalking the halls of Ingston's mansion, the mysterious Night Monster? Night Monster is one of those curious little Universal horrors that feels like a distant cousin to Dr. X, dear viewer. Both pictures flirt with the idea of regenerating damaged flesh, but where Dr. X leans towards science, Night Monster wanders off into mysticism, yogic trances, and talk of cellular rebirth. And when you remember this film was made in 1942, with America deep in the middle of the Second World War, the premise becomes even stranger. Real soldiers were returning home horribly wounded, blown to bits, yet here we have a horror film centred on a crippled man seeking violent revenge for the loss of his limbs. Whether that reflects anything deeper is debatable. Frankly, this is a B picture built for sensation rather than psychological depth, so fuck knows. Atmosphere is really the film's strongest asset. Universal standing sets do a lot of the heavy lifting. Looming gothic interiors, fog drifting across the grounds, and long, shadowy corridors perfect for skulking about in. Horror fans may notice something familiar about the surroundings too. The mansion interiors would later appear in The Wolfman and the Ghost of Frankenstein, and even some of the Wolfman's prosthetic hands and feet were apparently recycled for this production. Nothing went to waste on the Universal lot. The film's advertising promised Bela Lugosi and Lionel Atwill, two giants of Universal horror, but anyone expecting a Lugosi showcase will be sorely disappointed. Lugosi appears as the mansion's butler, played unusually straight and without the sinister theatrics audiences expected. Lionel Atwill fares a little better, appearing briefly as a doctor before being murdered rather early on. Considering both actors were weathering professional scandals around this time, they were probably grateful for the loose dimes. Around them is a rather ragtag and bobtail gallery of characters. Perhaps the most memorable of the lot is Leif Erikson's chauffeur, lecherous Laurie, a thoroughly rapey piece of work, dear viewer, the sort of hand-up-the-skirt smirking lech who seems to think no is purely for foreplay. At one point he pushes his luck with one of the frigid old maids and ends up clawed across the face for his trouble. Today that sort of behaviour would probably land him in handcuffs. One sequence that genuinely stood out for me comes when an Indian Swami demonstrates his powers, slipping into a trance and conjuring a skeleton from a buried tomb, dripping in blood, while discussions turn to the possibility of regenerating human tissue. It's a bizarre, almost ethereal moment that nudges the film away from conventional mystery and firmly into supernatural boundaries. Behind the lens was Ford Beebe, making his directorial debut after years working his way up through the Universal system. Night Monster was shot in barely 2 weeks. That speed apparently impressed Alfred Hitchcock, no less, who attended a rough-cut screening while filming his Universal thriller Shadow of a Doubt on the lot. Hitchcock reportedly enjoyed the film, but what really caught his attention was the remarkable pace of the production. Filmed over 11 days in 1942 before arriving in cinemas that October on a double bill with The Mummy's Tomb. So where does that leave Night Monster? Well, for me it's a film with a pretty sinister atmosphere, especially when the frogs stop croaking, and a few intriguing ideas bubbling under the surface. But if I'm honest, it's also a little on the dull side, and my attention did wander from time to time. So I'm going to give Night Monster 2.5 phantom footprints out of 5. An atmospheric oddity, but hardly a monster of a movie, night or day. The Duke de Richelieu and his friend Rex Van Ryn pay an unexpected visit to young Simon, only to discover he has fallen into the orbit of a fashionable society that is in truth a satanic coven led by the charismatic occultist McCarter. They rescue Simon, but the danger follows them home. Powerful entities are unleashed, and McCarter's will reaches across distance to reclaim his disciple. The Duke realizes a greater rite is coming, a May Day Eve ceremony in the woods where Simon and the innocent Tanith will be offered to the powers of darkness. Spying on the gathering, they witness the coven summon the devil himself. Barely escaping with their sanity, the Duke prepares a desperate defense using ancient protections of circle, salt, and incantation. For McCarter will not abandon his prize. He intends to rip open the veil between worlds, and if he cannot claim their souls willingly, something far older and far more terrible will come to collect them. Death itself.
Once breaks into the circle. If we once catch sight of his face.
God, take this, say it! I daren't!
The Devil Rides Out, another Hammer film explored in much deeper detail in my previous Look, Look and Look Again episode, part of the ongoing Hammer odyssey. So if you want the full excavation of themes, symbolism, and Wheatley's occult ideas, I strongly recommend seeking that out. The film exists largely because of Christopher Lee, a devoted reader of Dennis Wheatley's 1934 novel. He championed the project relentlessly until Hammer acquired the rights. Producer Anthony Hines then made the inspired decision to commission Richard Matheson, yes, that maestro again, to write the screenplay. Matheson understood immediately the secret of the material: play it absolutely straight. No camp, no irony, treat the supernatural as real and therefore frightening. Terence Fisher was given unusual freedom and assembled exactly the cast he wanted, thank God for that. Filming began in 1967 at Elstree, with night shoots in the surrounding woods, where Lee later recalled freezing through damp English evenings while performing lengthy rituals and confrontations. An extraordinary 7 weeks were spent on special effects, a luxury by Hammer standards, and Dennis Wheatley himself visited the set, later sending Fisher a congratulatory telegram after seeing the finished film. When released in America, it was retitled The Devil's Bride, distributors fearing the original title sounded like a western. What Fisher delivers is pure conviction, good and evil presented not metaphorically, but as opposing forces occupying the same world. Every performance is perfectly judged. Lee's Duc de Richelieu radiates intelligence and authority.
Briggs, do you believe in evil?
As an idea.
Do you believe in the power of darkness?
As a superstition.
Now there you are wrong. The power of darkness is more than just a superstition. It is a living force which can be tapped at any given moment of the night.
Charles Gray's MacArthur is the personification of charm, gnarled around menace absolute.
The power of the will is something people do not understand, attributing to it mysterious qualities which it does not possess, being merely the power of mind over matter, or in the greater number of cases, the power of mind over mind, as your mind now is succumbing to mine. For as you look into my eyes and listen to my voice, your will is leaving you, slipping away, and you are now beneath my influence.
Even the supporting cast play it with unwavering seriousness, while James Bernard's score thunders like a liturgical chant, driving the perfect visuals forward. And here, dear viewer, is where I plant my flag. This is the ultimate, for me, Hammer movie. Not merely a favourite, the apex of the studio's achievement. It sits comfortably in my personal top 10 films of all time, and I've seen loads. And I will go further. It is one of the greatest British horror films ever made, surpassed in my opinion only by The Wicker Man. If Hammer Studios ever toked deeply from the very essence of horror and chased the perfect high, this would be the consummate result. From the hypnotic opening credits as though hell had dropped acid to the final confrontation, it never once winks at the audience. It believes completely, and because it believes, so do we. A masterpiece without hesitation. The Devil Rides Out receives 5 black grimoires out of 5, and if I could give it any more, hell I would do.
You are watching BBC2. Our Masters of Terror season continues, featuring some of the great names of suspense and horror. In a moment, Black Friday, a rare screening and its first showing on British television. Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi star in this unusual thriller, in which a doctor performs a most unorthodox experiment. transplanting the brain of a murdered gangster into the body of a mild-mannered professor with remarkable consequences. Just after midnight, here on BBC2, we present a colour movie from Hammer Film Productions, The Mummy. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee appear in this tale of an ancient Egyptian priest restored to life and seeking vengeance upon those who have disturbed his tomb. But first, a darker day than most, Black Friday.
Professor Kingsley is a mild-mannered academic whose life is shattered when he's caught in a gangland shooting. To save him, Dr. Sovak performs a forbidden experiment, transplanting part of a dead gangster's brain into Kingsley's own. At first it works. Kingsley recovers, returns home, back to his old life, but something else has come back with him. Moments of confusion give way to something far darker, another voice, another will, clawing its way to the surface. Because the gangster isn't gone, he's still in there, and he wants vengeance, and his $500,000 back. Black Friday was yet another screenplay written by Kurt Siodmak, who, during this era, was responsible for a healthy gamut of pot boilers and monster mashes for Universal Pictures, plenty of which we have explored together, dear viewer. Siodmak returns to a familiar trope here, the transplant, or in this case a partial transplant, of the brain, something he would later develop more fully in his 1942 novel Donovan's Brain. Black Friday's 3-week schedule commenced on the 28th of December 1939, and initially Boris Karloff was to play the double role of Professor Kingsley, and Bela Lugosi was to play the role of Dr. Ernest Sovak. At the 11th hour, however, Karloff relinquished the part and requested the role of Sovak instead, throwing an almighty spanner in the works. Lugosi was relegated to a member of the mob, a huge demotion, and if you ask me, a waste of his talents. The plum role went to Stanley Ridges, who, though virtually unknown, grabbed it with relish. Ridges was an English actor. Alas, we can only ruminate, dear viewer, on how the original lineup would have played out. Hats off to Ridges, though, who handles the duality, which is probably no easy task, with assurance, aided only by a modicum of special effects from Jack Pierce. Karloff leers and lisps in his trademark fashion, adopting a scrub brush tash and tight white wig as Sovak. The character begins affable enough, but when the scent of $500,000 wafts his way, he turns remorseless, callous, and a manipulative figure. Karloff once again goes the final mile in this film, shuffling towards old Sparky, as he had in The Walking Dead, though there in The Walking Dead it was filmed infinitely better and was much more moody. We get a Batman-esque whiz of Sovak's notebook in a montage, telling us how he got to this stage that quickly become monotonous and jarring. To be honest, for me Black Friday plays more like a Warner Brothers gangster flick, and the horror sci-fi element feeling sort of like tacked on. Director Arthur Lubin aimed for an unhorrid horror picture, but this ultimately works against the film. What looks promising on paper never really quite materialises to the screen, I'm thinking. Karloff and Lugosi together again, some light shadow play and recycled Universal scores from their other horror films are nowhere near enough to make this a convincing hybrid. Lugosi is seriously underused, and the Hungarian accent jars against the gangster mould. He does have one notable moment, though, shoved into a cupboard and suffocating while his slack-twatted mole is strangled, made all the more absurd by a publicity stunt claiming his suffering was somehow real, somehow hypnotically induced, courtesy of an on-set hypnotist and occultist, famous in the day, a Dr. Manly Hall. The film didn't fare particularly well at the box office, which is a shame, as this would be the final Karloff-Lugosi pairing, stretching all the way back to The Black Cat in 1934, but never the twain met again. For me, Black Friday is a disappointing affair overall, though I did enjoy the closing scene, where Kingsley slips back into the gangster id and the mob's spirits rise from the classroom in phantom fashion. As double bills go, this for me is the seasonal clunker, earning just 2 Jekyll and Hyde personalities out of 5. One for the completists.
You never saw the day I couldn't break you apart, Miller.
In 1895, an archaeological dig in Egypt uncovers the tomb of Princess Ananka. When the expedition leader, Stephen Banning, reads a forbidden scroll, and the shock shatters his mind. Years later, in England, artefacts from the tomb arrive with a mysterious Egyptian benefactor. From a marsh, the ancient priest Caris rises, sworn to avenge the desecration. One by one, those connected to the dig. But the horror deepens when John Banning's wife bears an uncanny resemblance to the dead princess. Now the mummy no longer seeks revenge alone. He has come to reclaim his lost love, and nothing living will stand in his Fausty path.
Caris was sentenced to have his tongue cut from his mouth, so that the cries he would utter during the fate that awaited him should not offend the ears of the gods.
So, dear viewer, the marketing promised a creature torn from the grave to terrify the world, smashing spines and walking through walls like a spectre. This wasn't really the case, but as a hook for bums on seats, ideal. Peter Cushing, ever meticulous, pointed out the artwork even showed a torch shining straight through the monster. To lend the illustration a touch of credibility, he convinced Terence Fisher to stage the famous harpoon sequence, though, sadly, the copper's beam through the torso moment never existed outside the painter's imagination. Historical accuracy also takes a few blows. Egyptian gods are misnamed, inscriptions are complete nonsense, and the supposed hieroglyphics translate to nothing remotely ancient. Atmospheric, yes. Authentic, not remotely. Come on. In an odd way, the film anticipates later stalk-and-slash horrors, a relentless figure advancing step by step, implacable, unstoppable, only here his digits are wrapped in bandages rather than black leathered gloves. A stately, eerie, and very handsome Hammer production, I felt. Not quite the studio at its ferocious peak, but getting there. My verdict for The Mummy, 3.5 grains of sand out of 5.
Go now, Caris. Kill the last unbeliever who disturbed the sleep of your beloved.
You are watching BBC2. In a moment, as part of our horror double bill, The Strange Door, Charles Laughton and Boris Karloff star in this tale of secret panels, dungeon cells and screams in the night. At 11:25 we continue with a colour feature from Hammer, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, starring Andrew Keir and Valerie Leon. The legend of Terra, an Egyptian queen said to possess a power beyond the grave, brings a series of disturbing events upon those who uncover her resting place in this modern-day tale of ancient evil. But first, the key is already in the lock. The strange door.
If I find you up here again, I'll feed your liver to the swine.
Denis de Beaulair arrives at the grim castle of the sinister nobleman Cyrillien de Malatois, and quickly discovers he's not exactly a guest. He's a pawn. Malatois intends to force Denis into marriage with his niece, the young and terrified Blanche. Why? Because a sadistic lord believes the two will loathe one another, a cruel scheme designed to settle an old family vendetta.
Yes, my dear brother, she shall know the agony of betrayal as I've known it. She shall suffer as I've suffered. And that's my gift to your child. A wedding gift. A husband for her, a son-in-law for you.
But Malatois is hiding an even darker secret. Blanche's father has been rotting for years in the castle dungeon, kept alive only by his loyal servant Voltan. When Denis and Blanche unexpectedly fall in love, Malatois' carefully laid revenge begins to unravel, and the furious nobleman turns to far more brutal measures to make sure his twisted plan is carried through. Inside the damp, crepuscular halls of the castle, love, vengeance, and a very strange door lead to a deadly reckoning. The Strange Door from 1951 is loosely adapted from a short story by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Série de Malatois' Door, though the film feels less like a literary adaptation and more like a dry run for the gothic cycle Roger Corman would later unleash in his Edgar Allan Poe colour films. All the familiar tropes are here, the obligatory castle, dungeon cells, and instruments of torture. But the real spectacle is, of course, Charles Laughton. As Cyrillien de Malatois, Laughton gives us a magnificent grotesque. He's a purring plum duff with that great podgy face, porcine scowling eyes, and a voice that seems to relish every barb as much as he relishes his mutton, tasting the misery he's about to cause. You'll often hear people say that Laughton goes wildly over the top in this film, dear viewer, chewing the scenery with gay abandon. In truth, he's far slyer than that. Much of the time he underplays it, drawling his lines, watching the people around him like a cat watching disorientated canaries.
I don't know who you are, sir, and I don't care. You don't know me.
You're mistaken. Denis de Beaulair, I know you well. At least by reputation. I said you were expected. Will you permit me to introduce myself? I'm Alan Sieur de Malatois.
When he does allow himself the occasional flourish, it lands beautifully. Opposite him is actor Richard Stapley as Denis de Beaulair, the unlucky young rogue who finds himself trapped inside Malatois' castle and sporting a natty 1950s pomade ahead of his time for the 18th century, seemingly. Actor Stapley was one of those dependable leading men Universal liked to keep around during the late 1940s and early 50s. Tall, handsome, and solid enough to anchor a story without drawing too much attention away from the main attraction. Here he plays Denis as a decent, level-headed hero, trying to navigate a castle full of lunacy. Sally Forrest plays Blanche, the film's obligatory damsel in distress, wide-eyed, perpetually alarmed, and largely there to be menaced by her uncle and admired by the hero. Forrest had started out as a dancer before moving into films, and Universal clearly valued her for these soft romantic roles. She fulfills the assignment perfectly here, the endangered beauty at the centre of the storm, and certainly pleasant enough on the eye, while the villainy unfolds around her. Sharing the screen, of course, though far more restrained, is Boris Karloff, appearing in the sympathetic supporting role as a servant Voltan. Karloff brings a touching sense of lapdog simpleton loyalty and a hint of melancholy to the character, tending to the imprisoned Edmund in the dungeon below the castle. It's a more genteel performance than audiences might have expected from the man who spent so many years playing monsters. However, he's not hesitant to wield a blade and get into punch-ups when his life and those he cares about depend on it. Behind the lens, the director was Joseph Pevney, who would later become far better known for his television work, including several memorable episodes of Star Trek. Here he keeps the production paced and provides that wonderful gothic atmosphere. The film's gothic flavour is much closer to Horace Walpole than the Marquis de Sade, though. Melodrama and frock coats rather than a genuine perversity. We are still under the Hays Code after all, we mustn't forget that, dear viewer. The film eventually builds to a rather elaborate climax involving secret mechanisms and slowly crushing stone walls powered by a water wheel. Rather good. It's a little sequence that stretches things just far enough to become slightly ridiculous, but still vastly entertaining. Technically, The Strange Door is often labelled a horror film, though in truth, and for me, it played more like a historical thriller. There are no monsters here, unless you count the twisted mind of Sir Alain himself. And in the end, that's really the reason to watch the film. Because when that purring plum duff Charles Lawton is on screen, dear viewer, the whole thing becomes mesmerising. He would have made a superb Bond villain if he shed a few stone and popped on a Nero collar. I was gripped from start to finish with this film, an unexpected highlight of the season for me. Oh, and those costumes, exquisite! Even if they were borrowed, their opulence makes The Strange Door seem like a polished production, rising it above B-movie status. So I am going to give The Strange Door 3.5 rusted locks out of 5. And it's definitely worth opening the door just to watch Lawton work. Marvellous. In ancient Egypt, the sorceress queen Tira is buried alive with her sacred relics, a severed hand taken to prevent her return. It fails. Centuries later, an expedition uncovers the tomb, and on that very night, the explorer's daughter, Margaret, is born in England. 20 years on, she receives a ruby ring taken from the burial, and the moment it touches her flesh, another mind awakens inside her. One by one, the relics are gathered, and those who possess them begin to die. Margaret is no longer herself. Tira is rebuilding a body, a will, and a kingdom, and when the last piece is restored, she will walk the earth again. There again, I actually covered Blood from the Mummy's Tomb in far greater detail in an earlier Look Again, part of my ongoing Hammer Odyssey. So do check that one out if you want the full Ramesses into its themes and origins. Of all the Hammer productions, this one is the saddest behind the lens. Christopher Wicking adapted Bram Stoker's The Jewel of the Seven Stars, but the production quickly became troubled. Only a day into filming, Peter Cushing, originally cast as Professor Fuchs, received the news that his beloved wife Helen had died suddenly of emphysema in hospital. He withdrew from the film and, by all accounts, never truly recovered from the loss. Andrew Keir stepped in with barely a weekend to learn the role. The misfortune continued. Director Seth Holt, who had previously given Hammer Taste of Fear and The Nanny, was guiding the film with a real atmosphere when, at only 47, he suffered a fatal heart attack during production. The cast were devastated, particularly Valerie Leon, who was playing the dual role of Margaret and the ancient Queen Tira.
The film was very jinxed, really. I mean, of course, losing Peter at the very beginning was very sad. Luckily, they got another Hammer actor in called Andrew Kerr, and he became my father. But then we heard a young man from the arts department was killed on his motorbike, which was very sad. And then, after 5 weeks of filming, Seth Holt, lovely director, had had hiccups for a week. And, we used to sit in rushes and think perhaps it was quite funny, him hicking away. And then one day I went into the studio and I was told that Seth and his wife had given a dinner party the previous night. And when the guests had gone, he just turned to her and said, "I'm going," and died of a heart attack. That really upset me. I mean, I'd worked with Seth many years before when I'd just come into the business, and it was a film called Monsieur Lecoq, and I was just standing in for an actress called Julie Newmar. I never thought one day I'd be his leading lady, and I was so sad. But the worst of it was the show must go on. Michael Carreras took over from the filming because, Hammer was quite low budget, and they did not allow me to go to the funeral. And on the day of the funeral, I remember the scene. I remember crying and them having to patch me up. It was a scene with Berrigan in the asylum and everything, but they would not let me go to the funeral, and I'll never forget that. It was very sad. I heard it was quite spectacular with horses and the carriage and everything. So yes, a very troubled film, and it was the first time I'd been the leading lady, so it was quite difficult for me, really.
Managing director Michael Carreras ultimately completed the remaining scenes himself, simply to bring the picture to completion. And the film itself is unusual for Hammer. Rather than another bandaged monster shambling through corridors, this is a more metaphysical story about possession, reincarnation and obsession, unfolding in modern London suburbia. At times it is wonderfully eerie, wind-lashed nights, jackal apparitions, and a creeping sense that something ancient is patiently assembling itself again. The performances are solid, and Valerie Leon in particular leaves quite an impression, understandably memorable to more than one generation of viewers. Yet it never quite becomes the great film it threatens to be. The deaths often lack impact, the narrative wanders, and despite flashes of imagination, the whole thing feels slightly compromised, a production haunted by circumstances as much as subject matter. And so, dear viewer, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is of interest, but also instantly forgettable. Apart from Valerie Leon, who could forget her? My dad's fantasy female, as Mum recalls. One can see why. I award Blood from the Mummy's Tomb 3 pharaonic limbs out of 5.
In a moment here on 2, The Mummy's Hand, starring George Zucco, Eduardo Cianelli and Dick Foran. Kept alive for 3,000 years by a strange elixir, the ancient guardian waits to destroy any who disturb the tomb of the Egyptian princess, Ananka. Just after the news and weather, around midnight, our colour feature is The Satanic Rights of Dracula, with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. When Professor Van Helsing investigates the death of a government agent, linked to a satanic gathering, he begins to suspect that his old adversary may once again be at work. Vampirism, conspiracy, and modern science combine in this later hammer shocker, but first the grip tightens with The Mummy's Hand.
Down on his luck in Cairo, American archaeologist Steve Banning believes his career is finished, until a fragment of ancient legend points to the long-lost tomb of Princess Ananka. With the backing of the flamboyant stage magician Salvani, Steve and his wisecracking partner Babe Jensen and Salvani's daughter Marta set out into the desert in search of the greatest archaeological discovery of their lives. But the tomb of Ananka is not unguarded. Standing against them is a sinister high priest, Andoheb, sworn protector of the princess's sacred resting place, and he will stop at nothing to keep her tomb from prying infidels. To defend the ancient secret, Andoheb calls upon a faithful servant, preserved for centuries and bound by dark ritual, to obey the priesthood. A towering bandaged figure rising from the darkest recesses of the past, Caris, and tonight the mummy walks. But as Steve and his entourage draw closer to the hidden tomb of Princess Ananka, they may discover some secrets of the ancient world were never meant to be disturbed. For the first flick in this double bill, dear viewer, we turn our attention to The Mummy's Hand, released by Universal on September the 20th, 1940, and directed by the industrious Christy Caban. The Mummy's Hand wasn't born from a sudden burst of artistic inspiration. It was born from something far simpler: money. Universal had just enjoyed handsome profits from Son of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man Returns, so the studio naturally asked itself a very simple question: why not wake Caris up again? The answer was this picture. Produced on a rather lean budget of about $80,000, with the shooting beginning in late May and June of 1940, the result is not quite a direct sequel to the 1932 classic starring Boris Karloff, but rather a kind of reimagined continuation that borrows liberally from that earlier picture while building its own small mythology. This time the musty odour belongs to Caris, played by former Western and Captain Marvel star Tom Tyler. Tyler had previously made a name for himself riding horses and chasing outlaws across dusty prairie towns and shazamming the criminal classes, so lumbering rather stroke-like through the desert as an ancient Egyptian guardian was quite the career change for him. Universal's legendary makeup artist, Jack P. Pierce, the man responsible for the looks of Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman et al., and Karloff's original mummy, returned once again to wrap an actor in bandages. For close and medium shots, Pierce used his painstaking technique of gluing strips of cotton directly onto Tom Tyler's face, building up those deep creases and folds that give the creature its ancient wizened appearance, a look that may strike a chord with anyone who has encountered certain leathery expats who insist they're 60 despite appearing to have been pickled in cheap booze and baking in ultraviolet light for the best part of a century. But filmmaking is always a compromise between artistry and practicality, and Tyler reportedly found the process rather uncomfortable. For wider shots, he was allowed the luxury of a rubber mask, which was quicker to apply and far easier to endure beneath the hot studio lights. Tom Tyler later recalled that getting the cotton and spirit gum removed at the end of the day hurt like the devil, which gives you some idea just how grueling Jack Pierce's monster makeups could be. Universal also added a clever visual trick. To make Caris appear more unsettling, Tom Tyler's eyes and even the inside of his mouth were meticulously blacked out frame by frame in many close-ups. The effect gives this incarnation of the mummy a hollow, unnatural stare that I found genuinely eerie in some scenes. The desert excavation scenes were filmed not in Egypt, but on the Universal backlot in a rocky stretch of hillside known as Gaussman's Gulch, named after Universal set decorator Russell A. Gaussman, who worked on many of the studio's horror productions. The film's cast is where much of the enjoyment really lies. Our hero, archaeologist Steve Banning, is played by Dick Ferran, an actor more commonly associated with the era of singing cowboy pictures. Alongside him is Peggy Moran as Marta Solvani, the daughter of the genial magician who finances the expedition. Moran was a familiar face in Universal films during the late 30s and early 40s, often cast as a spirited young heroine with a bit of a backbone. Marta certainly has that quality. She's feisty, independent, and not afraid to challenge the men around her when she thinks they're talking shit.
Are you Steve Banning?
Well, maybe.
Well, dispense with the fooling around, Mr. Banning. Hand over that money.
Money? Hey. Now, wait a minute. Little girls that play with guns is liable to get hurt.
I'll get hurt. Now, how about that money?
Hey, you do all right with that cannon, don't you?
I've been making my living with it since I was 7.
At the same time, this being a Universal adventure of the period, dear viewer, she does eventually melt rather obligingly into the arms of our heroic archaeologist. The comic relief arrives courtesy of Wallace Ford as Babe Jensen, Steve's wise-cracking partner. Ford brings plenty of energy to the role, though his humour occasionally pushes a little harder than necessary and gets on your tits sometimes. But the real scene stealers here are the supporting players. First, there is George Zucco as the fanatical high priest and Doheb. Zucco was a master of suave villainy, able to deliver menace with the calmest of voices. In truth, he's considerably more intimidating than the bandaged creature he commands, and one can even feel a soupçon of sympathy as he attempts to defend his people's sacred tomb from opportunistic Western exploiters. Cecil Kellaway stars as the charming magician Solvani. Kellaway had a natural warmth that made him enormously likeable on screen, and he steals several scenes here as a genial stage illusionist, a man who can produce drinks with a flick of the hand with gleeful ease. For my money, Kellaway absolutely walks away with the picture. He is wonderful. The story itself borrows heavily from the Karloff film, the tragic tale of Paris and Princess Ananka, the forbidden resurrection attempt, and the terrible punishment that followed, but this version introduces the mysterious Tana leaves, which control the mummy's actions, a piece of mythology that would carry forward through the rest of Universal's later mummy films. Production values are modest, but there are still some striking moments, particularly the final confrontation set, dominated by 2 enormous stone jackal heads, which give the climax a surprisingly impressive scale. Some sets were leftovers from the movie Green Hell. All told, The Mummy's Hand is unmistakably B-movie fare, a brisk 67-minute adventure with a script perhaps thinner than a mummy's bandage. It doesn't approach the brooding power of the 1932 original, but it remains an entertaining entry in Universal's monster catalogue. And among the quartet of mummy films that followed, it may actually be one of the stronger outings. And so, dear viewer, while it may not reach the giddy heights of Karloff's immortal performance, it still provides a lively hour in the company of desert tombs, ancient curses, and one particularly hollow-eyed walking corpse. For me, The Mummy's Hand gets fingered 3 times out of 5. I rather enjoyed this one. An enjoyable 67 minutes of vintage Universal monster fun. In 1973 London, a police raid on a country mansion uncovers politicians and industrialists conducting black mass rituals. Inspector Murray calls in cult expert Lorimer Van Helsing, who recognises one attendee as a scientist secretly developing a weaponized strain of plague. The trail leads to a hidden cellar of captive vampire brides and to a powerful corporation funding the research. Its elusive chairman is no businessman. He is Count Dracula himself.
You are Count Dracula. Of course. Mr. Denham, the powerful recluse. Here you are safe. No one expects to see him. Not in the daytime. Soli Deo Gloria. Nisi Dominus. Frustra.
The Vampire Lord plans to unleash a global epidemic and end humanity altogether, while claiming Van Helsing's own granddaughter as his bride. Now the hunt becomes a race against apocalypse as Van Helsing confronts Dracula in his final ambitious and most nihilistic scheme yet. I covered the Satanic Rights of Dracula in much greater depth in an earlier Look Again, part of the Hammer Odyssey, so do take a peek if you want the full fangs of its production and its curious place in the Dracula cycle. Originally, the film carried the truly dreadful working title Dracula is Dead and Well and Living in London. Thankfully, someone came to their senses. By 1973, Christopher Lee had grown weary of the cape and fangs, returning only because of contractual obligation and making no secret of his feelings, calling the project fatuous, pointless and absurd. Even so, he fought to restore at least fragments of Stoker's dialogue, determined the character retained some dignity. Director Alan Gibson essentially created a companion piece to his Dracula AD 1972, reuniting Van Helsing, Inspector Murray and Jessica, this time played by Joanna Lumley. The tone is darker, though, less mod pop, more cold conspiracy thriller. Don Houghton's script places Dracula not in castles but boardrooms, reinventing him as a wealthy corporate figure facilitating a global plague. It's a wonderfully bleak idea, a tyrant vampire who despises humanity yet cannot exist without it. The film also delivered one of Hammer's more infamous moments. Valerie Van Ost's staking in the titty sequence, censored in most prints for many years, involved a telescopic prop stake and an alarming quantity of Kensington gore. According to Lumley, it looked disturbingly real, and audiences eventually saw the full effect only with later restorations. Warner Brothers declined a proper American release at the time, and the film wandered cinemas under retitles for years, but its reputation has steadily grown. Gibson skillfully shoots modern London with eerie emptiness, deserted streets and motorbike-riding henchmen, and black mass scenes that finally get the ritualistic menace right. It is a very autumnal, wintry feel.
We filmed in frosty weather, outside running through bracken and snooping along through dark, squeaking undergrowth to the forbidden mist-strewn cellar door. There were tremendous special effects, buildings which, like the burning bush, burned but were not consumed, mouldering bodies and flying cloaks, and Christopher Lee's 3 sets of eyes. Prepare to bite. A few veins, ready to bite, riddled with red squiggles, and bite, blood red.
Add Peter Cushing's ever-reliable Van Helsing and Lee's coldly apocalyptic Dracula, and the result becomes an outre hybrid. Part horror, part espionage, part dystopian fantasy. It's pure 70s Hammer. Contemporary, slightly wacky, quite violent, and far more sinister than its reputation suggested, dear viewer. Satanic Rights, for me, is wonderful pulpy trash for the flared denim and sheepskin coat brigade in the best possible way, so I award it 4 cases of acral necrosis out of 5. I really do love this film, as it's proper Friday or Saturday night horror, which on the whole never failed to disappoint me. I grew up with this movie, after all.
You are watching BBC2. For the time being, we conclude our Masters of Terror double bill this week with a touch of science fiction. In a moment, It Came from Outer Space, starring Richard Carlson and Barbara Rush. While investigating what appears to be a fallen meteorite, John Putnam discovers an alien spacecraft buried by a rockfall. His story is dismissed until the behavior of the townspeople begins to change in rather unsettling ways. After the news and weather at approximately 11:25 here on 2, we present Quatermass and the Pit, with Andrew Keir and Barbara Shelley. When strange prehistoric remains are uncovered during work on a London Underground extension, Professor Quatermass is called in to investigate. The discovery leads to evidence of a visitation in the distant past and to something ancient that may not be entirely dead. But first, perhaps it's best to keep an eye on the neighbors. It Came from Outer Space.
John Putnam, an amateur astronomer living out in the Arizona desert, witnesses what appears to be a meteor crashing into the hills one quiet evening. Dragging along his skeptical girlfriend, Ellen Fields, and a small group of locals, he heads out to investigate, only to discover this is no meteor at all, but a spacecraft swiftly buried beneath an avalanche. As Putnam tries to convince the authorities of what he's seen, he's stonewalled with disbelief at every turn. But something in the town has shifted. People begin to return from the desert, changed.
George? Frank? Keep away.
Not violently, not grotesquely, but subtly wrong. Familiar faces just slightly off kilter, voices that no longer carry the same warmth. Among them, Ellen herself. As paranoia tightens its grip and Putnam grows increasingly desperate, he finds himself caught between rising xenophobia and a far more unsettling truth. That whatever has arrived may not be here to conquer at all, but simply to pass through, with little regard for the consequences to those in its path.
Look.
What's that?
If you're looking for the DNA of It Came from Outer Space, it begins loosely with Ray Bradbury, because Bradbury was never really interested in nuts and bolts science. His stories are about people, how they think, how they fear, how they react when something unfamiliar encroaches on their world. And in the early 1950s, dear viewer, fear was very much in vogue. This is a film born out of the loins of Cold War unease, that creeping suspicion that the enemy might already be among us. The public were becoming aware of communist infiltration, particularly within the entertainment industry, and cinema responded. Science fiction, which had once been pulp escapism, suddenly grew gnashes. It became a way of exploring paranoia, of asking uncomfortable questions. Who belongs and who doesn't? But what's interesting here is that it came from outer space doesn't follow the expected path. The aliens, or xenomorphs as they're referred to, aren't conquerors. They're not here to invade, dominate or destroy. They're stranded, marooned like travellers shipwrecked on an arid island. And that one decision shifts the entire film into something far more thoughtful. The real threat isn't them, it's us. Now, originally Bradbury's conception, and indeed director Jack Arnold's preference, leaned heavily towards a psychological piece of drama. No creature, no reveal, just an implication. Universal, understandably reserved, especially with the film being shot in 3D, insisted on something more tangible. After all, if you're asking audiences to wear funny glasses, you'd better have something leaping off the screen at them, wouldn't you, dear viewer? The creatures are barely seen, and when they are, it's fleeting. A creepy, almost abstract form, a single globular eye, a haze of vapour, something gelatinous and indistinct. Lit carefully, often obscured, it becomes less a monster and more like a presence. There's a sequence in the mine that uses low-key lighting to remarkable effect, not showing too much, just enough to destabilise the viewer. It always reminds me, the creature here, of Alpha Centauri out of the Doctor Who's Peladon stories, but far less penile. The first concept leaned toward a humanoid creature for this film, with its brain exposed, quickly abandoned, though the design seems to have found a second life in the Metaluna mutants of the film This Island Earth, if reports are to be believed. And crucially, the film lets us see through the alien's perspective, that warped bubble effect, achieved by blowing a specially treated film over the camera lens. And that gives us a literal alien point of view. One of the first films to really attempt that, I believe. It's simple, but boy, is it effective. Richard Carson takes the lead as John Putnam. He became something of a fixture in these roles, the intelligent, grounded outsider, a man who sees clearly while everyone else panics or dismisses. He'd returned to something similar in Creature from the Black Lagoon, and Universal clearly recognised the value in that type of character. You see echoes of it later, with actors like John Agar and Rex Reason popping up in sci-fi genre films of the time. What I liked about Carson here is that he doesn't play it as a hero in the traditional sense. He's frustrated, isolated, and also, as the film goes on, increasingly desperate. The town doesn't believe him, and worse, it doesn't want to. That's where the paranoia creeps in, not in hysteria, but in quiet, chilling moments. To hammer home the otherworldly in a nuanced way, there's a brilliant touch with the character of George staring directly into the sun without flinching. Small, almost throwaway, but it hits the mark, dead centre.
Yes, the sun. Beautiful.
You found nothing up here?
Nothing.
And then there's the dialogue that carries the unmistakable imprint of Bradbury's literary sensibility. Lines that feel almost poetic. Talk of life pulsing through telephone wires, of unseen presences brushing up against the everyday. It gives the film a strange, slightly dislocated gloss at times. Not quite dreamlike, but not entirely grounded either. I noted a moment in the desert sequences where you get the sense that the aliens are eavesdropping through the phone wires, almost a schizophrenic cadence. Shot on a budget of around $750,000, it makes extraordinary use of its environment. The desert becomes something alien in itself. Jack Arnold would return to that idea in Tarantula and other films, but here it feels fresh. Those wide landscapes, the depth of field, especially in 3D, give the film a real sense of scale. This barren, dry landscape has remarkable depth, with foreground, midground and distance all harmonising together. Even the mineshaft sequences, which can feel a bit flat in 2D, take on an almost vertiginous quality in 3D. For the movie, the entire production was shrouded in secrecy. Cast and crew sworn not to reveal key elements, partly so Universal could beat Warner Brothers' House of Wax to cinemas as the first major 3D release. Musically, it's equally interesting. A composite score by Herman Stein, Henry Mancini, and Irving Gertz opens the movie with something almost comforting, a kind of Americana warmth that lulls you into a false sense of security. Then, as the spacecraft arrives and crashes, the tone fractures. And yes, you get that unmistakable theremin sound, already something of a cliche even then, but used here brilliantly, not just as shorthand for madness, which was utilised with insanity of the humankind in 1940s cinema, but here to expand it to the external and ultimately to the alien invader. Even structurally, the film does things a little differently. One of the few American films of the period rarely to place its credits at the end rather than the beginning of the film. A small touch, but it adds to that sense of stepping into something already in motion. I first saw this years ago. I'm fairly sure it was Channel 4 and it stayed with me. Watching it again now, it's clear why. It's a moody, intelligent piece, and it's just restrained enough to let the unsettling do the work. So yeah, a cracking slice of 1950s paranoia sci-fi, but with a brain behind it. Performance, cinematography, sound and story are the perfect blend here. I'm giving It Came From Outer Space 4 close encounters of the blobby kind out of 5. It's a genuine classic, and a quietly influential one at that. What a film to pop up first in the last double bill of the Masters of Terror season for 1979 on BBC2. And from one sci-fi classic here, we look at another. While excavating a new underground line at Hobbs End, workers uncover ancient skulls, and beneath them, a mysterious metal object first mistaken for an unexploded bomb. Professor Quatermass is called in, and what he finds defies both science and religion.
Good grief. They form a pattern. More exactly, they form a pentacle. One of the Kabbalistic signs used in ancient magic.
The buried capsule contains the remains of insect-like beings from Mars. Millions of years ago, they altered primitive humans, leaving their memories buried in our minds. Now the machine awakens, releasing a psychic force that turns Londoners into a very violent mob. As the energy peaks, a colossal horned apparition manifests over the city itself, the ancient Martian purge beginning again. Quatermass must stop it, or humanity will finish the work the aliens started and exterminate itself. I explored Quatermass and the Pit Dear Viewer in much greater depth in the Hammer Odyssey, so do seek that out if you want the full bells and whistles of its themes and ideas. Quatermass and the Pit had actually been proposed as early as 1963, yet took 4 years to reach the screen. Nigel Neal himself was delighted with the finished picture, calling it a splendid production.
Hammer had wanted to do it for some time, but I think I held off because I didn't want to see Mr. Dunleavy on the screen again. I was very happy with Andrew Keir, who they eventually chose, and very happy with the film.
Filming moved to MGM Borehamwood, and with Val Guest unavailable, direction passed to Roy Ward Baker. the first of several Hammer films he would helm, dear viewer. Andrew Keir assumed the role of Quatermass, though the shoot was not always harmonious and several cast members remembered a demanding production. Julian Glover performed his own stunts, including his fall into the pit, while the makeup effects, impressive for the time, were also notably uncomfortable for those enduring them. In America, the film was retitled 5,000,000 Years to Earth, distributors fearing the name Quatermass meant little overseas. Plans even existed for a fourth Hammer installment and a BBC collaboration, though these never materialised, eventually leading to the 1979 television continuation with John Mills. What truly distinguishes the film is its welding together of science and superstition, Neil's recurring obsession and trademark ancient folklore, possession, evolutionary memory, and alien influence all bounce off each other. Duncan Lamont's terrifying psychic seizure and the scrumdiddlyumptious Barbara Shelley's laboratory ordeal, performed with extraordinary, almost orgasmic finesse, remain among Hammer's most unsettling sequences. The move to colour gives the film remarkable force. Psychic violence, erupting crowds, and the towering Martian manifestation are staged with ambition far beyond the studio's usual means. Heightened also by Tristram Carey's electronic score, which hums and throbs with a mounting trepidation. Dense, intelligent, and genuinely inventive, one of Hammer's most ambitious achievements. Quatermass in the Pit gets 4 maniacal Martians out of 5. I was lucky enough to catch this at the cinema quite recently, and on the big screen it's even more stellar. Unfortunately, the chap next to me had a bogey lodged firmly up his nose, and every breath produced a faint whistle that slightly spoiled the mood. Though, to be fair, dear viewer, it still made a refreshing change from people endlessly rattling their fucking crisp bags.
Look out! The demons. It's all right. They're dead. They've been dead for a long time.
Well, I do hope you enjoyed that. A trip down memory lane for those who were there, and for the rest of you, perhaps a doorway into wonders still waiting to be discovered.
And was I all right?
Oh, you'll do. But before we go, a heartfelt thank you to all of you who make up this glorious fiefdom. I couldn't do this without you. My love to each and every one of you. And next time, our penultimate stop as we arrive at 1980.
In the meantime, we wish our darling fiefdom a very happy Easter.
Indeed. May the Easter Beagle bestow sweets in ridiculous abundance. And rather wonderfully, 2 missing episodes of Doctor Who have now been found, which feels like a gift in itself for Easter. Plenty to savour, I think, while we fill our bellies with far too much sugar. I do love this time of year.
And the same from yours truly.
So until next time on Look, Look and Look Again, it's good morning, good afternoon and good evening from me. With love to you all, happy Easter, spring felicitations and cheerio.